So, Elizabeth, Dr. Sandis, recently completed her PhD at Oxford, and she now holds a Leverhulme Fellowship at the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon. Trained as a classicist, she moved into the field of Renaissance drama for her doctoral research, specialising in Elizabethan and Jacobean plays in Latin. Her most recent publication is a special issue of Renaissance Studies, Latin Drama, Religion and Politics in Early Modern Europe, co-edited with Professor Sarah Knight. She's currently writing a book about teenage angst on the university stage and researching Stuart political history. A slight difference between the two. Elizabeth.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming. Now, this talk has been billed as an introduction to the play that you're about to see, and it is an introduction that you'll get, but I'm aware that we have quite a few specialists here who have snuck into the audience, even though they don't actually need an introduction to Samuel Daniel, so I've got my eye on you, John. Let me introduce you to another specialist, Brian McMahon, who's going to lend me his skills as an actor. Thank you, Brian. He's a much better actor than me. He's also male, which really helps if you're going to recreate Oxford drama. It's an all-male environment at the 17th-century university. And Brian here is a bona fide Oxford student, or was until pretty darn recently. Were we in the same year? Close enough? Yeah, close enough. And here he is as the delightful old curmudgeon, Melibæus. Listen out for possible references to Oxford. Take it away, Brian.
You gentle shepherds and inhabitants of these remote and solitary parts of mountainous Arcadia, shut up here within these rocks, these unfrequented cliffs, the walls and bullocks of our liberty, from out the noise of tumult and the throng of sweating toil, rattling concurrency, and have continued still the same and one in all successions from antiquity, whilst all the states on earth besides have made 1,000 revolutions and have rolled from change to change and never yet found rest, nor ever bettered their estates by change. You, I invoke this day in general to do a work that now concerns us all, lest that we leave not to posterity the Arcadia that we found continued thus by our forefathers' care who left it us. For none of you, I know, whose judgments grave can aught discern, but sees how much we are transformed of late, and changed from what we were, and what distempers daily do arise amongst our people, never felt before, at which I know you marvel, as indeed you well may marvel, whence they should proceed. And so did good Augustus here, and I, until we set ourselves more warily to search it out, which by good hap we have, and found the authors of this wickedness.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much, and in particular thanks since I gave you about 4.5 minutes to rehearse that, which I think is quite realistic for some plays. You know, you've got to stage them realistically. Actors don't get that much time, especially when I mess up. Sorry. So what wickedness is Brian Melibæus talking about? What is all the trouble going on in Arcadia? And most importantly, who is to blame? I don't want to give away the ending, for this is a speech taken from Act 5, and the play's imminent denouement. But I can guarantee you'll enjoy the badass characters who deserve their comeuppance at the end. Here's a description of one of them. A man that knows the world, hath seen abroad, brings those perfections that do truly move, a gallant spirit, an understanding love, a man with brains, basically, who's seen the world. So compared to the standard shepherds hanging around the place, he's much more interesting. This is Techne speaking to Chloris in Act 2, Scene 2. She's trying to sort of sell a man to her, basically. And I love the tone of the comparison that she makes here between the types of men that are on offer in Arcadia. On the one hand, you've got beef without brains, one of these rude, unconceiving swains who would seem but a trunk without a mind. I love that line, a trunk without a mind. On the other hand, you've got the thinking woman's crumpet. But of course, he isn't. The thinking woman gets away from him as fast as she can. And the savvy Chloris gives the reply to Techne. Techne, methinks the praises that you give shows your own love. And if he be that man you say, 'twere good you kept him for yourself. Ha. Fine. Chloris is rather interesting, not your standard nymph, and Daniel really tries to develop her character more than some of the others. In fact, he even has quite a bit of fun with the idea of her as the leading lady in her own play. Let's have a look at this. And thou shalt be with all posterity among the examples held of cruelty, and have this savage deed of thine be made a sullen subject for a tragedy, entitled Chloris. And therefore go, says Amaryllis, go, and Dorinda chips in, oh, go on, Chloris, go. This is one of these really comical moments when the excesses of rhetoric really champion over all sense of any practicality. Chloris is being shouted at by her fellow nymphs to run after Amyntas before he kills himself. Chloris proceeds to give a long speech about how she must run after Amyntas before he kills himself. Rhetoric is something you just can't rush, even when you're in a rush. Now, so this is really a story of nymphs and shepherds, classic stuff, but not always quite what you'd expect. And remember that every time a character enters the stage, the male actor beneath the costume is an Oxford student, required to play roles ranging from acerbic old geezers to cautious nymphets, as Brian will now demonstrate. There is an added layer of humour in having our eye on a young man playing a nymph. I'll be Augustus, Brian will be the nymph, though this is just going to be a minor note for him. This is the opening of the play, where two elderly gentlemen are discussing the dreadful ways that young girls paint themselves nowadays. I know, it's dreadful. And the extreme fashions which are not traditional Arcadian dress. Tusk, tusk. Augustus says, and methinks too the beauty of our nymphs is just not the same as it wont to be. That rosy hue, the glory of the cheek, is either stolen, or else they have forgot to blush with shame, or to be pale with fear. Or else their shame doth make them always blush, for always doth their beauties bear one hue, and either nature's false, or that's untrue.
Excuse me, can I ask you to speak closer to the microphone more often? Because there are various sides that you're saying when you're in the middle of the room that I can't hear.
Absolutely, and I'm really glad you said that. Thank you. Though I'll try not to shout into it because I've got dictaphone in front of me, but it's more important that you can hear. Can people at the front hear, however?
Just.
Okay, you sure? I'll go for something in the middle, and apologies if I'm shouting in anyone's ear. Wave at me and say I can't take it anymore. Right.
Soft speaking is entrancing.
That's good to know. Thanks for the feedback. So, the dramatist is really having fun here with the paraphernalia of acting, just as we are. The makeup and the dress, it's all seen by the audience who know they're watching a play full of cross-dressed young men gadding about as nymphs. Thank you, Brian. Today's Oxford is, of course, very different. Whatever Daniel might say about Arcadia being immune to change, you remember, still the same and one in all successions from antiquity, as Melibæus put it so eloquently earlier. Thank you. So today we won't be seeing an all-male cast. Times have moved on. But to give you a sense of what the costumes were like in 1605, I've dug up a manuscript from Oxford University archives that details what they were wearing and what props they were carrying. And the first entry for Daniel's play runs as follows. In primis, as in the first instance, 4 shepherd's coats of taffeta of several colours. Item, 7 hats of taffeta. Item, 7 sheep hooks. Am I speaking loud enough again?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, feeling a bit worried about it now. You can guess who would need the sheep hooks. These are shepherd's crooks, obviously. And I've been told you can actually use them to catch sheep. That's why they have a hook. Not sure I want to try that though. This being Arcadia, there's no shortage of shepherds. However, this is a play designed for a royal audience, and Oxford were prepared to splash the cash, or at least borrow lots of expensive things from the royal store back in London. So, despite the rustic setting, our shepherds are dressed up to the nines with elaborately decorated costumes. And what I find really delightful here is that the level of detail that goes into this. Many garments were embroidered with gold and silver thread, with carefully woven designs and patterns. Here are some examples. Item, 1 round kirtle, that's a sort of tunic, of tawny satin embroidered all over with gold and silver like wheat ears. Item, 1 loose gown of ash colour satin flourished all over with silver like flames. Item, 1 doublet of pink coloured net work flourished with gold and silver and works of silk like birds and fishes, and so on. Here is Christchurch Dining Hall. When you enter the hall today, you'll find a theatre programme with a plot summary, except for the ending, of course, I've left that out. Suffice it to say here that you'll encounter pairs of shepherds and nymphs and their love stories, and you'll see how the world of Arcadian country life bumps up against urban cultures and unscrupulous businessmen looking to make a fat pile of cash, and some sinister misfits trying to grab as many girls as they can. I might have some water, actually. Let me tell you a bit about the hall that you'll be sitting in and what the stage looked like in 1605. Because for me, this is one of the really exciting things about today's performance, that we have Shakespeare's Globe performing Daniel's play in its original venue. And the last time I did this, when we staged Gage's Dido and Dido, Queen of Carthage, in Christchurch Hall, I made a rather clunky attempt to resurrect the original audience as well. Not digging them up as such, obviously, but Gage's Dido was written for the Polish ambassador, who happened to be visiting Oxford in 1583. And as he was swinging by, they thought they'd stage a play for him because really that's the done thing. So I invited the current Polish ambassador to come and join us for our production here in 2013. And he said he enjoyed it, but he might have just been being diplomatic. Fortunately, for the 2013 incumbent, that time it wasn't in Latin. I translated it for him. But don't worry, you're not going to get Latin either. This is an English play. It always has been. It's never been a Latin play, except in the many versions before, which I may have chance to get into, but perhaps we'll be lucky and run out of time. But overall, this is more unusual for university drama in the Renaissance period to have plays in English. Not so much for royal visits, perhaps, but overall, the vast corpus of university drama is in Latin. So you can count yourselves especially lucky this time. In the audience in 1605 for Daniel's play was Queen Anne, the Danish queen who married King James I, or James VI if you're Scottish. It wasn't possible to invite Queen Anne today, I'm sorry, but you'll have to fight amongst yourselves for who gets to be her. On to the venue. So, in 1605, Christchurch was already a place that Daniel knew intimately. His brother was a student at the college, and Daniel himself had been a student down the road at Magdalen Hall, which is now Hertford College, in the 1580s. We can see his trail of signatures in Oxford University records beginning in 1581. That's when he appears in the university subscription book and the matriculation register. His younger brother, John Daniel, you might have heard of, he did very well as a musician at court, and the two brothers worked together as a rather talented pair. In fact, when James came to power in England in 1603, the two of them were summoned to provide entertainment for the king and queen while they were on progress in the West Country. They were staying on an estate called Tottenham Park, and John Daniel, Samuel's younger brother, was just on the point of finishing his music degree at Christ Church. This was September 1603, and it was a really important stepping stone for Samuel Daniel, and John Daniel too, building up royal patronage for their work. So 2 years later, in 1605, when Daniel returns to Oxford, the scene of his student days, was he feeling a touch nostalgic? Are some of his rather pointed descriptions of a place stuck in the past, never changing, like Arcadia, is this just about Arcadia? I'll leave that to you to decide. Remember that Samuel Daniel is a master of the hidden jibe, the careful detail, the subtle nuance. This really helped him when he got into serious trouble over Philotas, the play which, though he denied it, had a political edge. And in the Queen's Arcadia, I can't help wondering if his descriptions of men shut out, retired and sequestered from public fashion might be hinting at something closer to home and not just the ancient Greek stage set. Talking of Greek stage sets, let's have a look at the stage in Christ Church Hall. Where's my pointy thing? Here's a pointy thing. So this is BL British Library Editional 15505, 21st folio. It's a really fascinating document. I know I'm biased, but I've set it lengthways for the moment just so that it's maximum size, so you can hopefully see it better. Can you? Is it okay? Turn the lights off? No, happy. John Orrell's identification of the representation of Christ Church here rests on the measurements of the room. It was a hall that was really unusually long and unique in having internal measurements of 115 feet by 40 feet. And 115 foot long, that's pretty long, as you'll see when you walk in. The hall at Hampton Court, for example, is only 97 feet long, even though the width is similar to here. This drawing in the British Library manuscript focuses on the details of how the auditorium seating is to be set up. It leaves 33 feet for the stage area, up here. That's about a third of the hall. The seating area is a big scaffold sloping upwards towards the stage, upwards that way, fitting at least 800 people. For the stage, the designer uses the term the scene, harking back to the concept of the skene on the ancient Greek stage, which literally means tent, because it used to signify the building behind the stage where the actors got changed and stored their props. That's where our word comes from. The stage area in 1605 was raked to produce perspective, and it sloped down towards the audience. Down that way. The seating areas were also raked downwards from the stage. So this is quite a large construction. There's a lot of effort going into this. I'm afraid we haven't reproduced it today. Water break. This means that the social hierarchy is conspicuously present, and it's represented physically as well. So you've got the royal toffs and privy councillors at the top, and the undergraduates at the bottom. Guess who are the ones seated and who are the ones left standing? But don't worry, you'll all get seats today. And you'll be glad to hear that the size of your seat won't be Jacobean. Theatre goers to the 1605 performance were allotted a tiny space each along benches, even if they were aristocratic. 8 inches across if you were a lady or a royal servant, 6 inches if you were a gentleman in one of the upper seats. That's got to hurt. As John Orrell points out, this isn't random cruelty, it's just the Jacobean standard. Now, marked A, there's the pointy thing. Marked A on the design is the entry into the hall. Hang on, leave my glasses. I'm blind these days. Curse the mid-30s. So, marked A on the design here, we've got the entry into the hall down here, where you will also enter at 2 o'clock this afternoon, but actually the location of the doorway has been altered since 1605. Let's not split hairs, but it's slightly different now. Anyhow, under Alpha, over here, is labelled "the sides closed, that people run not under the scaffold." So try to close this area off so people just don't go willy-nilly underneath the scaffold. Health and safety, very important. Now I is the stage area. Area K is labelled in this wonderfully legible hand. The aisle for the king, a foot elevated above the ground, mounted unto by 3 degrees, 1, 2, 3. There's these levels there. 4 inches high apiece. It's unequally divided to answer the angles of the seats, says the design. Okay, so the poor chap building it is thinking, gosh, it's got to answer the angles of the seats. All that means is just mirror image. It's more complicated than it really in the description than it actually is in practice. Perhaps, I don't know, I've never built a theatre set like that. But I'd imagine this would be rather complicated. As you can see from the drawing here, a lot of care and attention went into arranging the sight lines, but not so that the king or queen had the best view, but that he or she be best seen by everyone else. This is quite an important feature of role plays at the universities. The monarch becomes part of the spectacle. Audiences are watching him, watching the play. Or in the case of Daniel's Arcadia, they're watching Queen Anne watch the play. Unfortunately, this means that although Inigo Jones, who designed the stage, had big ideas about creating perspective at Oxford, they were not really realised on this occasion. Oxford and perspective, I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere. Seriously though, Oxford in 1605 may seem an unlikely locus for theatrical innovations, but thanks to the injection of Inigo Jones and Samuel Daniel on the scene, literally, there were lots of new ideas floating around. New, when I say new, I mean Roman, obviously. But this was big news in England at the time, bringing Roman ideas onto the English stage. That was new in the sense of newly fashionable. Really cool. Neoclassicism, that's what it's all about. Rah. Ask me about this more later if you're interested. The concept of neoclassical architecture, neoclassical drama, it's quite a fascinating paradox, I think. Anyhow, back to Inigo Jones and his Roman inspiration for the Oxford stage set. This is where it gets fun and technical. He wanted to try out using devices called periactoi. These were pillars, basically, that revolved on the stage. They've been described by Vitruvius, the Roman architect and engineer, in Book 5 of his treatise on architecture. Periactoi were a feature of the Roman stage in the 1st century AD, a revolvable construction developed in the Hellenistic period. Because it's Hellenistic, hence the Greek term there, that's why it's known by the Greek word rather than, say, the Latin. The pillars were covered with painting, which could show different scenes and create the illusion of a rapid change of locations on the stage. Very handy. This was an exciting innovation which hadn't been tried in a university theatre before, or actually anywhere else in England. Inigo Jones wanted to experiment with it in court masks, and he did. He owned a copy of Vitruvius De Architectura on architecture, and you can see his musings and his scribbles in the margins of it. His copy of Vitruvius was a 1567 edition published in Venice. He was intensely interested in all things Italian, but everyone was in the aristocratic circles at this time. The Italian editor of the Vitruvius volume was Daniel Barbaro, and the book featured one of the most famous Venetians of all, Palladio, the 16th century architect. The 1567 book, in Jones's possession, featured an illustration by Palladio showing the design of a theatre which incorporated, wait for it, periactoi. So when Inigo Jones brought these ideas to Oxford for the 1605 role plays, it was quite something. One could make jokes about his revolutionary use of revolving stage scenery, but I'm not going to do that, obviously. Unfortunately, we don't know how the periactoi may have been used by Samuel Daniel when it came to his play Arcadia. But here is how Isaac Wake described its use during the tragedy of Ajax that same week in Oxford. Wake describes the play having 3 sets. The first showing Troy, the second showing woods and caves, and the third showing the Greek ships parked by the Trojan shore. Here's what a Cambridge spectator thought of the stage set at Oxford. Brace yourselves. He's pretty brutal about most aspects of what Oxford had to offer. I mean, you would, wouldn't you? His journal is full of wonderfully bitter comments, so he's not the most reliable of sources. But here is what he had to say about the use of pillars in Christ Church Hall. The stage was built close to the upper end of the hall, as it seemed at the first sight, but indeed it was but a false wall, fair painted, and adorned with stately pillars, which pillars would turn about, by reason whereof, with the help of other painted cloths, their stage did vary 3 times in the acting of one tragedy. Very cool. So Inigo Jones' exciting scenery and his attempt to create perspective was something of a novelty, and it had a knock-on effect on how the auditorium could be arranged around it, with a raked stage, as we've seen, and a raked auditorium, and arguments over who would get to see most of the king, not about how much the king would get to see. That meant that the guest of honour's seat wasn't quite at the right elevation, but, teething problems. Inigo Jones received the rather huge fee of £50 for his designs. Philip Stringer, or Stinger as I've come to call him, commented in his diary that Jones performed very little to that which was expected of him. Now, how are we doing for time? Depends how much you want, really. We'll struggle through. So, let's make some connections. I'm going to briefly dip into this, because there's a really interesting swell of who's who going on here, which deserves some attention. So some of these names you may know, some of them you won't. Philip Sidney, you may have come across Sidney's Arcadia, not to be confused with Daniel's play, the Arcadia, though the two are connected in some ways. Sidney died in 1583, so way before any of this happens, but his work is important. Mary Herbert is his sister, Philip Sidney's sister. 10 years later, after her brother died, she published an edition of Sidney's Arcadia. That's the 1593 edition. Again, don't get it confused with Daniel's Arcadia. But the confusion is interesting. It's quite important, actually. Around this time, Samuel Daniel is cultivating Mary Herbert as a patron for himself. He dedicates his 1592 edition of Delia to her, a sequence of 50 sonnets which really made his name and helped him to develop his network of patronage, really crucial for a professional poet. You can't, survive on nothing. You need those court connections, you need aristocratic patrons, you need to be connected. Incidentally, it was the Countess of Pembroke, that's Mary Herbert, who commissioned from Samuel Daniel his tragedy of Cleopatra, a companion piece to her own tragedy of Antony. She was a writer, translator too, very prominent actually in her own day. And I want to mention at this point that Daniel had made his name not through his plays actually, but through his poems. The Delia sonnets that I mentioned and the Complaint of Rosamond really were a great success. And then as a historian, he made his name as well. He wrote a mammoth civil wars, wonderful, but that's literally another story. It's a history of the warring houses of Lancaster and York. Think Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, and you're on the right track. So on with the connections. Fulk Greville, he created the 1590 edition of Sidney's Arcadia with John Florio and Matthew Gwynne, the next two on this list. So the three of them working together on Sidney's Arcadia produced an important team. Now Matthew Gwynne wrote the Latin comedy Vertumnus, which was one of the 4 plays staged here at Christ Church for the Royals in 1605. So he's here as well, putting on his show at the same time as Daniel. Gwynne was a close friend of John Florio. Gwynne and Florio liked to commend one another, rather conveniently, in paratexts to each other's works. Gwynne, for example, wrote verses of praise for Florio's World of Words when it was published in 1598. This publication is a really important milestone. It's the first really decent Italian-English dictionary. English interest in Italian is an important part of the story of late 16th century English literature. and it's a common thread that connects this group of people who are all engaged in producing, translating, adapting Italian, or patronising, in the best possible meaning, those who produce, translate, or adapt Italian themselves. So adapting and working with Italian fashions for English audiences. Audiences as readers and audiences as spectators. Italian is also a common thread when it comes to who's who and who knows whom. And crucially, who is in vogue, who's on top, who's well connected, who has established their reputation by 1605, and who is making Oxford look cool in 1605. Italian and Roman traditions of pastoral are a powerful force in England as a kind of cultural capital. Pastoral, think shepherds, maidens, leafy glades, highbrow, dreamy portrayals of lowbrow characters, but everyone speaking high-flown language of love and despair. That's really the idea of pastoral, and that's what Daniel decides to work with for his show, alongside Matthew Gwynne's Vertumnus, which is another story for another day. Now, when Gwynne came to publish his Vertumnus, he made a big splash trying to sort of big up who was there. So in the dedicatory epistles to his play, he makes an elaborate list of as many nobles as he can remember that were there on that night. He even points out who wasn't there in a sort of way of saying, but they were interested too, but it's not quite convincing. Anyway, the people he tends to focus on are the king, of course, but also the Herbert brothers, William and Philip, sons of Mary Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke. William and Philip Herbert were the incomparable pair of brethren, that's a quotation, to whom the first folio of Shakespeare's collected works was dedicated in 1623. So you might encounter them in that way as well. Gwynne is very courteous in acknowledging that Queen Anne really enjoyed Daniel's play, whereas King James, who saw his, not so much, but that, again, the accounts about it come from Cambridge. So, in the second letter of dedication from Gwynne of his play, which he dedicates to Philip Herbert, he writes that Euterpe expectans delineat Arcas. Euterpe of Arcadia, the play, in a sense, soothed her, charmed the queen. That's Queen Anne of Denmark. So when Daniel had printed his play the year before, so Daniel's play performed at the same time, but he published it in 1607. Gwynne published it in 1607. Daniel's came out in 1606. Gwynne published his in 1607. Daniel had changed the title of his in the published version. It was performed here as Arcadia Reformed, but then ironically it was reformed when it was published. Daniel had it rebranded so that it now became known as the Queen's Arcadia. And as you may have gathered from my article on the Globe website this week, there is something of a strategic move that's good for marketing. Marketing the play and marketing himself. We've used it as marketing. The Queen's Arcadia sells better than Arcadia Reformed. Everybody just loves kings and queens. It's a thing. Sadly. In the preface, Daniel celebrates the fact the Queen was there at the performance, whose happy presence, he says, did vouchsafe to bless so poor presentments, so being deprecating, self-deprecating, to grace the same. So she graced the performance with her presence. And when customers were browsing scripts in the bookshop, the publisher made sure that they saw this on the title page: a pastoral tragicomedy presented to Her Majesty and her ladies by the University of Oxford in Christchurch in August last 1605. Now, one interesting connection, Samuel Daniel was, we think, not only familiar with John Florio and his work. Remember, he was the Italian who created the wonderful dictionary, Italian-English dictionary, but he was also his brother-in-law. Although we don't know this for sure, perhaps John will have the latest on this. We have Dr. John Pitcher here with us, who is available to answer all questions on editions of Daniel, since he's working on his own. The first 2 volumes of his magnum opus are, fingers crossed, coming out in 2020. So I've been waiting for this, quite excited. His work is one of the reasons I suggested this play to the Globe, actually, because with the new edition of Daniel's works, we're going to be moving the field forward in exciting directions. And I really want to draw attention to remarkable figures like Daniel, who moved in interesting circles. He really fused university and court culture together and bridged the gap between the two worlds. He needed court connections to keep advancing in his career, but he also saw himself as a university man at the same time. And he wanted his work to be on the shelves of the Bodleian Library. Don't we all? As some of us have. In 1605, he offered a copy of his works to the librarian of the Bodleian, who was called, funnily enough, Sir Thomas Bodley. The volume he offered was a unique copy, specially adapted as a compliment to Bodley. And this unique copy is Bodleian. I'm going to read the label here, but you can see it for yourself. He replaced the original verse dedication, that was to Queen Elizabeth, who's by now popped her clogs, unfortunately. So he replaces that dedication with a new poem entitled SD, Samuel Daniel, to his book, in the dedicating thereof to the library in Oxford, erected by Sir Thomas Bodley Knight. Erected as in re-erected. This is a refounding of the Bodleian Library. This presentation poem, printed on 2 conjugate leaves, featuring handwritten corrections by Daniel, follows the title page to his handsome works folio and celebrates the library where he hopes will see his work sitting there on the shelves. Here in this goodly magazine of wit, this storehouse of the choicest furniture the world doth yield. And talking of this storehouse of the choicest furniture, guess why King James wasn't at the performance of Daniel's play at Christ Church, though his wife was. He was too busy being shown around the newly refurbished Bodleian Library down the road. But he really missed out, as you'll see.
One connection, if I may ask.
Do.
Spenser's Fairy Queen. How did it influence these poems? You know far more about it than I do, but I'm curious.
It's a really influential, very long work, as you know, but it's in that romance genre that brings together a ginormous jumble of stuff, and the length of it means that it's a source for pretty much. If you pick an Elizabethan poem, you're bound to find some of Spenser's Fairy Queen influencing it, especially with the pastoral. It's that mixture of elements. Perhaps we could discuss this at the end, because this is a very interesting. Thank you for bringing it up there.
My ancestor wrote a preface to it.
I see.
So
we shall talk. We shall talk later. Now, by the way, it was quite a coup for Daniel that his works were indeed accepted into the Bodleian Library. Thomas Bodley really wasn't keen on books in English, let alone English verse, so it was quite unusual. And Daniel's choice to write in English was important. His choice to write a pastoral drama is also important. His Arcadia at Oxford represents the first rendition of Italian pastoral drama in English, the very first one. It's an advertisement of his status as a scholar of Italian, both clever and well-connected. He's showing he's got the skills, he's showing he's bang on trend. In fact, he's setting the trend. And he actually met Battista Guarini in person, whose play Il Pastor Fido is a key model for the Arcadia. He'd met Guarini in person in Italy in 1590. So the 1605 dramatic fiesta at Oxford offered plenty of firsts. Exciting stage sets by Inigo Jones, the first recorded use of perspective scenery in English drama, and the first English imitation of Italian pastoral drama. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.